Welcome to the London Commercial Offices podcast with me, your host, Steve Berridge, Managing Director at Fidgens Cost Management. This is a podcast where we share the stories, career paths, lessons and insights from some of the industry's most influential people. Anything contained within our podcast should not be considered professional advice, and if you haven't done so already, please hit the subscribe or follow buttons to ensure you don't miss any of the amazing guests we've got coming up. It also really helps us grow the show. Thanks. I'm joined today by Rob Stewart, co-founder at Koba, a new player in the flex office market offering a unique evidence-based sustainable workspace. With a focus on transparency, circularity and healthy outcomes, Koba's first location in Manchester is due to open later this year. So without further ado, Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Steve. Lovely to be here.
We've got lots to talk about today in terms of Koba and your shared vision with Paul, but you'll know from other episodes, I like to start right back at the beginning. So our audience and me as well kind of get an understanding of what makes you tick and why we are where we are today. So I thought I'd try something different today. What did you want to be when you were growing up?
What did I want to be when I was growing up? I wanted to be like my dad, who was a fighter pilot.
Oh, wow.
And realised very early that that was never going to happen because I was blind as a bat. I used that as my excuse to hide the fact that I was also terrible at maths. And all of the things that my dad was naturally predisposed to being very good at, I sort of lent in the opposite direction. So for me, that became a pretty unobtainable goal from a very early age. And yeah, whilst I've got, brothers who remained really interested in sort of aviation and all of that kind of stuff. For me, I kind of sort of left it behind, recognized that it was never going to happen. So in all honesty, I'm not sure whether I've ever really known what I wanted to do. And I think if I look back at my career today, it's very peripatetic. It's kind of all over the place. I think if I tried to put my CV together now and sell myself to a standard recruiter, they would just throw me in the bin because I've been everywhere and done all types of different things, but I've not stayed in one place for any longer than 10 years. I think I'm always looking for the next interesting thing to do. And the older I get, the more I appreciate that that's a mindset that is good and has served me well to date, I guess.
A broad base of experience. So, picking then on perhaps your first career move, if we could start there, you might wish to start earlier, but I think if we could start at the first and just see sort of where that was and how that was a springboard for where you went.
Yeah, so the first thing that I did when I graduated was work for a brand marketing company, and I spent a lot of time trying to sell whiskey, which meant spending a lot of time in bars and getting free drinks and free entry to places and trips to China because the Chinese is a very big whiskey market. So spending time over there, it was very exciting, but I kind of just sort of bumbled around. I didn't think this was for me longer term. And I did that for a couple of years. And then
where was that in the country?
It was here in London. So yeah, working for an independent brand company that worked on behalf of Seagram's, which was a big US company that sort of grew out of the prohibition and still had a very kind of prohibition era to everything, which was, just do it. It doesn't really matter what it costs, yada, yada. They then got bought by Pernod Ricard, big sort of French conglomerate, and things changed a fair bit. But anyway, I was never really that keen on that. I was quite happy to think about what I was going to do next. And I think my next thing was, so my parents said to me, have you ever thought about broadcasting? And I just thought, well, how do you get into that, right? Like I was early 20s, incredibly naive. I would have assumed, probably quite rightly, that you would have had to have been doing local radio reports from the ages of 16 or whatever.
And did that kind of suggestion from your parents come as a sort of them witnessing a certain set of skills or interests that you had? What was the catalyst for them trying to suggest that? Or are they from that?
No, my dad was a pilot. My mum worked in aviation, and they were I think they were recognised that I was probably always interested in other stuff, and that might be an interesting thing to do. But I think the thing that crystallised it was at the time, and I'm dating myself here a little bit, there was a controller of the BBC called Greg Dyke who famously set up something called the BBC Talent Scheme. And the BBC Talent Scheme was open to everybody. And they would basically put out a nationwide call for people who were interested in doing X, Y, or Z. One of the things that they launched a competition around was to become a sports reporter who would eventually cover the Athens Olympics. And so I sent something in. I remember having to kind of record something and video me doing a kind of mock report of something or other. And then I got a letter back saying, oh, you've made the first round. And I thought, oh, that's good. That's got to be a good thing. So did the second one, I think. And then there was a third one, like the sort of final, where everybody who was all brought together, and we had to go to somewhere for the weekend and do a whole load of kind of mock reports with actual real BBC correspondents or reporters. So it all seemed very, otherworldly. Lo and behold, I won it, and I was given this, reporting gig at the BBC. So yeah, I went from, doing what I was doing to reading the sports news on Radio 1, Radio 2, BBC 5 Live, reporting on medals at the Olympic Games in Athens. And I, again, sort of in my 20s, I probably thought, oh, wow, I've made it, I've made it. But actually, that was the first time in my life where I recognized that I wasn't as good as I would like to be versus everybody else.
Early 20s, that's quite a young age to realize that.
Yeah,
from
maybe.
my self-experience, 20, 21, 22, you're still very much a young, cocky man.
Yeah, but there's nothing like going from nothing to being on network radio, where there are people with incredible kind of skill sets and experience that they've built up to make you realize that the only thing that is going to enable you to catch up with them is time, experience of literally just kind of like learning the ropes, earning it, right? And the thing about yeah, exactly. And the BBC talent scheme was very good. There have been some people who've gone on and had an incredible success. So including Rebecca Lowe, who now presents the Premier League football on NBC, I think I'm right in saying, out in the US. She was in the talent scheme the year before me. She's had incredible success. And others, like in other elements of talent, because people have gone into drama or whatever it is. But it is very hard to kind of just suddenly drop yourself into that competitive environment where people don't have the time to kind of walk you through things. And so I felt really uncomfortable. And as much as everybody on the outside was like, wow, isn't that amazing? And you've done that and done this and yada, yada. Like personally, it's probably the most unhappy part of my life because I just permanently felt so out of my comfort zone.
And was that kind of imposter syndrome style feeling or impatience in terms of wanting to be at your A game and knowing that you had a long road ahead?
I mean, it's a mixture of things, really. I just recognized that actually, if I'd have wanted to do this, the better route for me to have done was, instead of going straight to kind of network level stuff, which is, the Radio 2s, Radio 5s, 4s of this world, is that where you need to kind of be to kind of earn those stripes, as you say, is to do it in local radio, in local television, because pressure doesn't seem as much. You can make mistakes. Experience. Yeah, exactly. And it's very difficult to do that if you're doing stuff on Steve Wright's show, or if you're standing in for somebody, on the breakfast show on Radio 1, like we can all have sort of take our own view about what we think about Radio 2 or Radio 1 or even Radio 4, but these are listened to by hundreds of thousands of people. And it's a pretty kind of scary, lonely place to make a mistake when, your producer then says to you, well, you got that wrong. You take it home and you really kind of mull on it and stew on it. So in the end, I was just fortunate. I serendipitously found out that somebody who was working with Andy Murray, the tennis player, was looking for somebody to kind of come and help with quite basic sort of, media stuff like website and stuff like that.
Andy Murray is as a personal brand, so almost like a comm style manager.
Yeah. I mean, look, when he was very, very young, there wasn't really kind of much to do around him. It's like, it's very easy to say with the benefit of hindsight. And of course, in the years since, that kind of team and amount of people around him has grown, not massively substantially, but it has grown substantially, because that's just the nature of the beast in terms of being a ultra high performance sports person and also having your own image rights, which are tradable, etc. Yeah, so I had that opportunity, and I think I spent close to 10 years working with and around Andy, and it was really fun, to be honest, to be able to kind of stand on the fringe of the coattail of somebody achieving all of their dreams. It was a real eye-opening experience, and definitely it does instill in you the importance of hard work and perseverance, which, if you're going to be successful in anything in life, you've got to have that resilience. It's very easy to start a company. As you and I know, we can go on to various websites now and we can set up a company in 10 minutes. Very easy to do that. The reality is it's much more difficult to kind of build a company, get it to a point of critical mass, and be able to kind of even temporarily for a short period of time look around you and say, yes, this is successful.
It's also what is success, and it's. I was reading something the other day about finite or infinite success in terms of companies these days are measuring their success, picking a variable or a metric that suits their own narrative. It's amount of money we've made in this year. Okay, well, that's this year's success, but that's not company success in the infinite sense. The infinite sense is it going to outlast you, outlast the next generation? Yes, you can perform very well this year, but how about the next 30? So in terms of you jumping from BBC to Andy Murray's team, how did that come about?
It was an introduction actually through somebody that I knew sort of tangentially through work, who introduced me to somebody who was his agent at the time. So that's the story there. Yeah, it's kind of, really very serendipitous. I'd love to be able to say that it was because I knew somebody who knew somebody and they were all looking after me. It was just one of those random things, to be honest.
So that would have taken you up to your early 30s kind of time?
Yeah.
So that's early 30s, already 3 distinct career paths that you've done and ticked off your list. So then talk to me about the end of that sort of tenure with Andy.
I suppose this is kind of where you begin to understand that potentially you're sort of an entrepreneur, right? So if I think about everything that I'd done prior to then, I'd worked, for large organizations or, very highly visible kind of organizations. As much as Andy's an individual, everybody knows who he is, and very strong brand and financially kind of, strong, all of that kind of stuff. I just kind of wanted to spread my wings a bit and see whether I could do something of my own. So I originally went to work for a technology company, so very big kind of change for me. So moving from, the pretty kind of old-fashioned analog world of professional sport to startups was a big change for me. But I was working in a sort of, related industry in so much as it was technology, but it was health and wellness based. Did that for a year as a kind of, I suppose, relatively senior hire on their team.
Was that kind of strategy or was that?
It was commercial, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was a commercial role. And then left there, set up my own thing, which fell flat on its face. So another technology business fell flat on its face, which is a big learning curve. Invested a lot of time and effort in that, raised money, and it failed. But kind of these things happen. And so in between then and beginning Koba, I was doing some, I suppose you would call it teaching, lecturing, mentoring at University College London's deep tech accelerator, which is called Conception X. And so Conception X works with PhDs to enable them to learn the skills to commercialize their IP. So if you're doing a PhD and, in deep tech, so artificial intelligence, machine learning, satellite propulsion, whatever, these are long kind of drawn out affairs. A PhD is not something you do in a year, it's multi-year. And the aim of that accelerator is to equip PhDs, not just from UCL, but all over the country with the kind of skills and wherewithal and really the mentality to think about actually trying to turn the IP that they're developing as a result of their PhD into something that is saleable. And there have been some very big successes through that program. I'd love to say that I had anything to do with it, but I distinctly believe that's not the case. But if I did help the odd entrepreneur here or there in terms of the conversations that we had over that time, then I'll be very happy with that. But that kind of bled into Koba, really. So, the genesis of Koba is sort of really during COVID. And thinking, what was I going to do next? I was interested in commercial real estate and watching very closely the sort of conversations that were being had around the future of office. And obviously this was back at the time when I think everybody or most kind of smart people were saying the office is dead. Everybody's going to be working from home. I think my longer term view was that, we will move to a more kind of hybrid world, which I think we're beginning to see play out. I was in the city of London today and it was quiet. It's a Friday. But I was thinking, okay, well, if people are going to succeed in that space post-COVID, what is that product going to look like? In particular, Flex, because Flex was the part of the market that was, I think, already beginning to kind of pick up speed more than sort of traditional leasing. I think it was beginning to recognize, looking from the outside, that those sort of 10, 15, 20-year deals were going to become pretty thin on the ground, and that most companies, or an increasing number of companies, would want to have a bit more agility in terms of where they work and for how long, and that increasingly we may see, or we would see, companies that were willing to outsource workplace experience to somebody else rather than have to kind of do it themselves internally. But the big kind of kicker for me was around sustainability. So taking a macro view of the market, and this is a couple of years ago, I think it's strengthened a little bit since then, albeit with some kind of headwinds. I couldn't really see anything beyond sustainability being one of the top 3, maybe 2 decision choices for premium occupiers over the next 10, 15 years. And if that was the case, if that thesis was held water, then it made sense not to just kind of do it in a tokenistic way, but to actually look at delivering flexible workspace in terms of the design, the fit out and the operation through a more scientific, fact-based, evidence-based lens, because we could see, and we still see in the market now, and in a variety of different markets, people making claims about sustainability which are tenuous at best. And in a world in which there was kind of more robust legislation and regulation, they may even be kind of, in breach of some kind of, means of operating. So that really was the kind of thesis. And then it came down to testing that, right? So actually, it's one thing to kind of have the idea, but you then want to kind of robustly test that by speaking to people. We didn't have the budget to go out and do tons of market research. What we did have was the time to actually pick up phones and speak to people who represented a sort of, relatively kind of broad cross-section of what we felt was represented by premium occupiers. And for us, that's kind of everybody from a large listed company all the way down to SMEs and even below, right? But we spoke to a lot of people and the feedback was, this is increasingly important to us. And it was important for different reasons. So when you spoke to large listed companies, usually it was quite top-down pressure. So regulatory pressure or, pressure that they felt as a listed business needing to kind of communicate to their shareholders what they were doing. And then for smaller companies who were, unlisted, it was more bottom up. So it was their employees saying to them, what are we doing about this? What are we doing about that? Or frankly, even a fear of what they were going to be able to say when their employees came to them and said, we want to do this, why aren't you doing this? Or why aren't you doing that? Why are we in this building? Why aren't we doing X amount of stuff, right? So it just made sense for us to actually try and not just kind of make an incremental amount of progress towards sustainability. We really set ourselves the goal of what can we deliver right now within the limitations of a supply chain that frankly needs to adjust in order to provide more sustainable options, but also what can we deliver within a economic bandwidth, which means that we can't just go and throw all of the money in the world at it, right? Our view as Koba has always been, we don't want to be more expensive than other people. We want people to be making a decision where cost is equal and actually it makes more sense to be with us because we deliver X, Y, and Z, and all of those things are tangible and, demonstratable, as it were. And that's kind of what we set about doing. And I think we're at a stage now where we're beginning to see that actually that's how landlords feel like, and they feel that because their occupiers or people that they would like to be their occupiers are beginning to say those things to them in increasing amounts. And buildings don't inherently deliver that kind of experience. That's something that operational real estate has almost just an important part to play as the overall building itself.
Agree. How you occupy, how you use it, how you fit that out, what furniture you use to fit that out. I have checked you guys out online. One of the big things that you push is circularity of the products, your supply chain. We had Steve Gilchrist on, I think it was our first episode, big on circularity. So talk to me in terms of, there are a lot of flex operators out there. And I think a little bit of mysticism about perhaps how they operate, whether that's lease agreements, management agreements, very high, say what you can say, but at a high level basis in terms of how you guys were set up, how you guys have been funded. You and Paul, for example, do you share exactly the same vision? Were there challenges, were there differences about how you wanted to approach Koba? If you could touch on that, I think that would be really interesting.
Yes, I'll deal with the funding piece. So we are funded by two groups, essentially, one of whom is a high net worth person who's been involved in real estate and had a huge amount of success for a number of years, is very engaged, really looks at Koba as a very exciting development in a market that, from his point of view, perhaps hasn't changed an awful lot from a sustainability point of view over certainly 10, 20, 30 years. And the other group, which is one that I can mention, is Cast Interiors. So, again, this is kind of where serendipity comes into play. So when Paul, the MD of the business and one of my co-founders, was working at Hana, which was CBRE's flex product before it got rolled into Industrious, one of his first clients, I think, in the city was Cast, female founded, female led business that at the time, I think maybe 2019, was like 3 or 4 people. They're now, I lose count of how many they are. I'm going to say somewhere between sort of upper 70s and 90, and they're turning over, north of 50 or 60 million a year. So they're a massive success story. And I think for anybody who's met Zoe, the managing director, you'd probably fully understand why that's happened, because she's an unbelievable operator. Yeah, so they're our investors. Now, the other thing which is great about Cast is that it enables us, because of what they deliver. I mean, they're our integrated delivery partner, right? So in a sense, we're sort of like a vertical model. We are the operator, but all of the design, all of the fit out, everything is handled under the kind of Cast and Koba umbrella, which in theory, and we're beginning to see this in the site that we're working on in Manchester right now, means that we're just more efficient from the kind of landlord's point of view. We're faster. We get things resolved quickly. And actually, from a sustainability point of view, the beauty about Cast, and I'm almost 100% sure that we couldn't have done it with other people, is that we had a very clear idea about what sustainability meant to us. And I'm happy to go into that in more detail in terms of how we address embodied carbon and, what we're trying to do around circularity, etc. If we hadn't been working with or had as an investor somebody like Cast, it would have been almost impossible to do. The reason I say that is that they are exactly on the same page as us and as innovative and as on the front foot with regards to sustainability as we are. And so it makes what is fundamentally a difficult job, which is trying to bring a more sustainable product to market in a world which isn't set up to deliver sustainable products in the market. It makes that task a lot easier. But just to go back to what you were saying around Paul, no, we're fortunate, right? So Paul and I were introduced by Perkins and Will a long time ago now. Well, I say a long time ago in terms of, Koba's history, a fair amount of time ago. And it was, we were introduced because he was having similar conversations with people at Perkins and Will around sustainability. And I think we are, as a group, a really good match in so much as, I'm kind of like the sustainability guy, but Paul is also the sustainability guy. James, our FD, is also the sustainability guy. Taylor, our head of operations, who we've recently just brought in from Industrious, he's also our sustainability guy.
Which I think differs from potentially other people in the sense of, you'd have a CEO, an FD, quite siloed. And then you'd have, and I'm going to say a token sustainability guy, but you'd have head of sustainability. That is their focus. But it does mean that there's an element of internal selling that needs to happen, kind of ensure that sustainability is then put into all the other sectors within that business. But if it sounds like you've all cut you in half and you all bleed sustainability to start with when you're setting up a business.
Yeah, I think it's also the fact that it's also the approach that we've taken, right? So the whole Koba product has never been a sort of back of the fag packet sketched exercise about what sustainability means. I think one of the best things that we've done to date is we went through a pretty long and rigorous process with a organization called Dries and Sommer. They have a presence over here in London. The team is exceptionally good. But in Germany, where they're headquartered in Stuttgart, they are the dons of this stuff, right? As far as sustainability, sustainable real estate is concerned. In a sense, they're the originators of many of the things that we're trying to do because they own within their group of companies a business called Epea. And Epea was, kind of in a sense, the professor who set up that company kind of coined, sort of circularity in some senses, because he came up with this cradle to cradle definition, right? So in terms of the development story, we didn't just kind of sit down with Cast or sit down ourselves and say, let's do this with carpets or do that with this. Like, we went through a whole big strategy piece of work, which resides, in folders, on our drive, which has that North Star plotted out about where we want to go, but also demonstrates the kind of baby steps that we're going to need to take in order to get there. And through that engagement with Dries and Sommer, we also created our sustainability manifesto, which, if anybody goes on our website, that sustainability manifesto is pretty open and transparent. And we're not making kind of claims that we can't back up. I think the thing about us as a business is we recognize there is no silver bullet, right? Like, we as an industry, and when I say as an industry, I mean the office interiors industry, we're chucking, by some accounts, 300 tons of old office furniture into landfill every day, right? Like, that's an issue. There's a big problem with our attitude to kind of stud walls, et cetera, like carpets, yada, yada. We have a tendency, I think quite rightly, to focus on things at a building level. But when you look at the academic research around the lifetime greenhouse gas emissions associated with a piece of office real estate, around 40% of that entire greenhouse gas footprint will come from the interiors, because these are the places that get spaces that get turned over so much. So whilst as an industry, and I think as a group of kind of consumers, people who go into buildings, who take leases on buildings, who go into their office every day, we're looking, rightly at buildings being electrified and having great BREEAM scores and neighbours and this, that, and the other. Actually, like, there's a hidden dirty secret in the office environment, which is the amount of carbon that goes into interiors. Yeah, and that's one of the things that we're on a mission to kind of change with Koba. And we're doing it because we think it will resonate with, our customers, the people who use our space. We're not going to treat anybody like a mug. We want to demonstrate to people, well, actually, we've measured the amount of carbon that has gone in here. We'll give you, to the nth degree, as much data as we possibly can in a way which is consumable and easily digestible for you to understand the lengths to which we've gone to try and make this as sustainable as possible, right? But also demonstrating that data to flag up how much road there still is to travel. Because site 1 for us and site 10 will look markedly different, because we will have the benefit of time and new products and services coming into the supply chain that on site 1 they won't have been there.
Innovation,
yeah,
for you as a business, but also sustainability in the wider sense. You started off by saying that you've got a folder with your sustainability stuff in. You mentioned your North Star. Mm-hmm. Can we just touch on that then? So, as a business in its simplistic form, what is your North Star, and how are you using that to perhaps target locations or cities?
So from a sustainability point of view, I would say our North Star is really about us at a period in time in which we maybe have the luxury of being able to decide what we want to do with the business, right? So maybe somebody comes and knocks on our door and says, hey guys, you've done a great job. Here's some money. I'd like to buy it off you. I think we would like to be able at that point in time to reflect back and say, we definitely did change expectations around what office should be delivering, both from a kind of carbon point of view, from a circularity point of view, but also from a social impact point of view. We haven't covered this yet, but like, social impact for us is a really, really fundamental part of our delivery. And we've, just agreed quite an interesting, I'd say very exciting partnership with a national social mobility charity around us being able to kind of bring our vision to fruition. But I think to take it all back to a point, it would be for us to be able to reflect and say, yes, we definitely did shift the dial in terms of the industry that we were in terms of what it means and what it requires to design, deliver and operate more sustainable office space. And that, just as importantly, we had sped up change elsewhere amongst our peers by being open and honest about where we had wins that they could also do within their own sites. Definitely our attitude is not to play our cards close to our chest. It's to basically take an open hands approach and say, look, if we found this and it works for us and we're able to demonstrate that we've saved this amount of carbon, or here's a really interesting company working with demountable walls and it's actually a proper bona fide circular business model, and there's a company that we're talking to that we can't wait to land in the UK because they do just that, then we want to kind of disperse this knowledge.
I'm looking at your manifesto. That is number 7 on your manifesto in terms of making yourself as an open source business.
Yeah.
You've obviously got the sustainability side and the human factor that sits alongside that. So talk to me then about your new social mobility partnership that you guys have been working on.
So we haven't made an announcement yet, but I can tell you, I can sort of talk you in kind of general terms. So we had, and this is in our manifesto as well, actually, we'd always kind of had this thesis that offices, i.e. the places where we come to work, an untapped resource when it comes to delivering social good at a local level. And the reason for that thinking was that, flexible workspaces, in fact, offices in general, are collections of people who are highly skilled and to a lesser or greater extent also altruistic, i.e. that they are sometimes happy or they are motivated by doing good for others when there is apparently nothing in it for themselves, right? And I think most of us as human beings have had that feeling where you feel really good because you've given your time and effort to somebody else. You've not financially gained anything from it at all, but you've just had that sort of Ready Brek glow for people who remember the Ready Brek adverts of kind of feeling good at just about doing something good for other human beings, right? And what we recognized when we were looking at all of the sort of research and activity around commercial real estate was that a huge amount of, or a significant amount of this sort of social impact work was done at the design and the development stage. So you would have developers, making sure that 20% of their workforce was from local communities, et cetera, et cetera. But then actually when that building's built and delivered, it's going to be there for like 60 years. And what actually happens thereafter? Because you've got all of these smart, clever people coming into your building. And yes, of course, businesses have their own, social impact and charitable kind of endeavors. But what some of those really struggle with is actually making an impact in the immediate area where those people are. Because there's something really impressive and important about you being able to kind of sit across the desk from somebody and actually know that you're impacting them in a way that giving money to another country or to something in another town doesn't hit the same. There's no equivalence. Like, I'm not saying that one is better than the other. What I am saying is that there's something really special about being able to help people when you're able to kind of build a relationship with them. And so our whole idea was, how could we create or curate a program that would allow our occupiers to tap into that according to their own level of kind of motivation? Right. What we do know from reading the research, Deloitte does a millennial and Gen Z kind of study every year or so. And the data is quite clear that increasingly, particularly people of lower age, people who are coming into the workplace, are increasingly kind of trying to seek a sense of purpose that, traditionally people have found at home, in family, in the church, in community. And now those lines seem to have been blurred and people are looking to find that sense of purpose everywhere. So how could we as Koba provide opportunities to do that? And in a nutshell, our partnership with this social mobility organization, this amazing charity, will allow us to essentially create a class of 25, class of 26 of secondary school age kids who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, right? Who haven't had access to the kind of same help, support, luck, frankly, that by dint of where we were born and who gave birth to us, we've most likely had. And the idea is that we curate opportunities, we make it simple as Koba for these people to find those opportunities, and then we kind of, alongside our charity partner, make those opportunities work and make them run and capture the outcomes of that in terms of evidence to help, give them an evidence base that they can use to communicate to their own stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. And really, make these people, these young people, part of the fabric of our building, rather than see charity as something that happens away from the office space. What might happen if we could create an hour here, an hour there, where these kind of activities actually happen within our demise itself? So in a very long, convoluted way, that is what we're looking to do.
And that's going to be announced imminently.
Yeah, not too long. We're
Okay.
just kind of working on details for Manchester right now, but there are other kind of conversations we're having around active sites that we're looking at in London as well. But wherever we go in the UK, the beauty of this organisation is that we know that they're going to be there, right? So, and we're really excited about what we should be able to do with them over an extended period of time.
Fantastic. I think what I'd like to touch on is the podcast that you guys are working on now. So I think I'll kick off with that, and then we can go down that rabbit hole.
Sure.
Yeah. So in terms of then what wider sustainability, which is obviously sort of a central thesis for you guys. I know when we spoke briefly a few weeks ago, you mentioned that you were also launching a podcast. Not a competitor to us.
No.
And actually quite different. And we were talking about the differences of our podcast. You know, we're very niche focused. We're looking to target sort of seasoned industry professionals with a view of essentially helping knowledge transfer from upstream, downstream, sharing for the younger audience. You're slightly more broader in the sense of it is sustainability focused, but in the widest sense. So do you want to give us a quick intro?
So we kind of knocked around ideas. I'm sure like most people in most businesses, particularly startups, do. We'd knocked around ideas for a podcast for a while. And it's like you say, Steve, right? You can either do kind of what you're doing, which is quite niche, kind of focused on the industry, and there's obviously kind of huge value in that. I think I was always more attracted to doing something that would appeal to a bigger audience, and by implication, if you're going to do something that appeals to a bigger audience, you're not going to be talking about flexible workspace. Because it doesn't matter.
Whilst we're interested in it,
exactly,
the world isn't
right?
Interested.
Exactly. It's like it doesn't appeal to 99.9% of the populace. We sort of had this kind of quite highfalutin idea that what if we could do something that was actually a sort of standalone, meaningful climate podcast in and of itself, which was obviously kind of quite a big idea, more difficult to execute in reality. But the idea that I'd always had was, well, if we were going to do something like that, then actually rather than focus on the 0.9 to 1.1% of people on LinkedIn or elsewhere who frankly, whatever the kind of climate news is, will read it, will engage with it, will kind of get something meaningful from. We actually wanted to focus on the other 99% who we believe are, yes, interested in climate, but probably find it a bit too doom and gloom. That's a reality, right? It's like it's not the most heartwarming or uplifting topic, or at least it can be that way. And secondly, it's a topic where it's very easy to get sort of discombobulated by the science, right? So we set ourselves this idea of like trying to create a show that would work for that 99%. And so we do skew towards the kind of more positive. And what we're trying to do with the show is basically find what we think are really interesting hooks and people that the likes of you and I and our friends and family might listen to, just because the big topic of the conversation on each podcast is so mind-blowingly
I've got
weird.
to listen to that.
So the first person that the first interview that we did was with Professor Sir David King, and Professor Sir David King, as well as being one of the kind of cursors to Sir Patrick Vallance, who we all became familiar with during the COVID crisis. He's now the head of the Cambridge Centre for Climate Repair. And one of the things that Professor Sir Dave is doing is looking at ways you can refreeze the Arctic, right? So that already is kind of like mind-blowingly like, what on earth, how do you go about doing that? And the reality is there's really interesting kind of like already proven science that would enable us to do that, right? By essentially kind of like making the cloud cover more reflective by spraying salt water into the air. That kind of changes the characteristics of clouds, makes them more reflective, so whiter essentially. And that is a way and a means of being able to kind of reduce the temperature, because you're kind of bouncing the sun's rays back. He's also doing a huge amount of really mad stuff with synthetic whale poo. So dumping synthetic whale poo into the ocean to reinvigorate like local food chains. And one of the kind of upsides or benefits of reinvigorating local food chains is that you get these kind of phytoplankton blooms at the surface. And not only does that kind of invigorate, the little fish that get eaten by the slightly bigger fish all the way down to kind of sharks, etc. Those phytoplankton are good at sort of fixing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So there's these really kind of big, bold, mad ideas out there. Intriguing.
I'm listening, just the snippet alone.
Yeah.
I'm thinking,
exactly.
I would listen to that. I'm also thinking, from my perspective, trying to think of a title for this podcast, and it's going to be Rob Stewart, Whale Poo, The Silver Lining of Clouds.
Exactly.
But it does draw attention. And I think it
does. And then it enables you to kind of, you can then get into discussions around why the Arctic is important, right? There's a very strong reason why Professor Sir Dave King is very interested in refreezing the Arctic. It's because he is incredibly worried about the knock-on effects to the rate at which we are losing ice from the Arctic at a higher rate than we're losing, it from elsewhere. So, there are reasons that you can then unpack and interesting stuff that you can unpack from that. But the bit that we hope kind of sucks you in is this kind of mad idea at the top of it, right? So there's other people that we're hoping to speak to. So an outfit in the US who are looking to de-extinct the woolly mammoth, complete bonkers idea. Like the science is kind of increasingly getting to a point where they think that is viable. Talking to a company that is looking to reflect sunlight onto solar farms when they're in their natural nighttime to enable, those solar farms to generate electricity when otherwise it would just be pitch black. And ultimately, I think for me, climate is as much as it's a kind of story of doom and gloom, it is also a story. It's kind of twofold, really. It's like, one, the brilliance of like humans, like we're unbelievable at inventing stuff and coming up with new ways of doing things, but we're also incredibly bad at working together when we are facing these kind of huge crises, right? And we see that in Ukraine, we see that in the Middle East, we see that play out everywhere, right? Like when something really big and horrible is kind of needing to be dealt with, we act in our own kind of selfish national interest. For me, the whole topic is really interesting because you're dealing with the bits that humans are really rubbish at, which is kind of like figuring out a way of kind of coming together and resolving a problem like the climate crisis. But also you have these pockets of absolute brilliance who are coming up with on an increasingly kind of like crazy time frame, which give us the hope that we can kind of get out of this, right? So, and for that reason, I think climate can be really interesting to people. And that's what we're, fingers crossed, touch wood, that's hopefully what we'll be able to do with the show.
And what's the name of the podcast? Does it have a?
It has a working title, which is Climate Pass It On. So the other thing about the show is that the guest chooses the next guest and the next topic. Person X, kind of, we have them on, they talk about whatever, and then we then ask them, who would you like us to talk to next, and what would you like us to talk to them about? And so it just becomes this kind of relay race, you hope, of almost infinitely interesting conversations that could bounce around what is a very, very broad church in terms of climate. We're talking to a lady called Dr. Sasha Lucioni on the second episode. She's a global expert in AI and machine learning, but a lot of her work recently is focusing on the kind of environmental cost of AI because of the huge amount of energy that it consumes. So again, that's kind of, you wouldn't think that's a typical climate thing, but actually, where we're going with AI and energy consumption, it becomes a very important subject matter.
Look, thoroughly enjoyable 50 minutes, Rob.
Was that 50 minutes? Sorry.
That was 50 minutes. That's flown by. So look, I think we'll leave it there. I think for anybody interested in finding out more about Koba, obviously there's Google Koba on the website. I think we'll put your LinkedIn details in the show notes. So if anybody wants to specifically reach out to you directly, they can do. Again, Rob's on LinkedIn, so you can DM him. But look, Rob, thanks ever so much for coming on the show.
No worries. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much, Steve.
Thanks, Rob. This podcast is sponsored by Fidgins, a London-based cost consultancy. Please visit fidgins.co.uk to find out more about our market-leading service and some of the amazing clients we get to work with. We're super open to guest recommendations for this podcast, so if there's anyone in the industry you'd like to get on the show, please visit the website or send me a message on LinkedIn and I'll try to make it happen. Thanks and bye for now.